A soldier is always both predator and prey at the same time. A lot of his survival depends on accurate reconnaissance of the battlefield, so that he knows what to expect of the enemy before he makes a move. But what if his eyes deceive him? What if the enemy possesses a cunning, sinister way of tricking him into believing that they aren't even there? Welcome to Camouflage. I'm Indy Neidell. This is a World War II in real-time special episode about camouflage. Camouflage revolves around concealment and deception. It is both an art and a science, and aims at blurring the boundaries between the eyes and the imagination, between the real and the surreal. With the use of irregular brushstrokes, camouflage artists paint shapes, speckles, blotches, and stripes onto uniforms and the hulls of ships, tanks, and aircraft to make them seemingly disappear from sight. Specific colors are broken up so the form of the object merges with the space around it, as it bleeds into other forms, planes, and tones, as outlines coincide with other outlines. It sounds complicated, yet the goal is quite simple. The eye still sees the soldier lying there in the grass, or the cannon hidden in the bushes, but because of the effect of camouflage, it is unable to identify and translate what it sees, giving the viewer a false sense of security that there is actually nothing to be seen. This lures him into a trap by making him misapprehend the nature of the battlefield. The first mass-produced item that can be considered modern camouflage was introduced by the Italian army in 1929. The three-color telo mimetico was printed on waterproof tent sections that could also be worn as capes or buttoned together. The color scheme was deliberately chosen to resemble the Italian countryside, focusing on ochre, chestnut, and olive green. Later, this scheme would be painted on Italian tanks and aircraft, and eventually printed onto the jackets and trousers of elite units like paratroopers or the MAS. Similar to the telo mimetico, the German army introduced their own camouflage Zeltbahn in 1931. Its fabric was made out of a water-repellent cotton duck, and printed upon it was the splitter or splinter pattern. Its early paint schemes consisted of geometric shapes of green and brown color that were printed onto a gray or beige background. The Germans also painted an additional rain pattern of fine green lines on top of it in order to further break up the shapes. The fabric was reversible. The camo on the spring side was printed on a pale background, and on the autumn side on a much darker background. Overall, the splinter pattern was quite innovative and was backed by scientific as well as aesthetic methods to make the soldier blend in with the environment around him. More than 10 million of those tent sections were made between 1931 and 1945, with small changes here and there. The Luftwaffes, for example, had a grayer tint to it, and the paratroopers had smocks with a denser pattern and more numerous geometric shapes printed, right? By early 1943, German High Command issued an order to repaint all its fighting vehicles in a new, more advanced three-color scheme. I'll go into tank camo in a minute. But for the Army, this meant that they had to update their uniforms to coincide with the new paint scheme. The splinter pattern was further modified by blurring the edges to angular shapes, and a new variant, the swamp pattern, was introduced. This swapped the gray of the splinter pattern for beige and the brown for green. In addition, a reversible winter parka was then widely available and came in a set with a helmet cover, a smock, over trousers, and several other informal items. The effectiveness of camouflage patterns naturally depends on the varying distances between the spectator and the camouflagee. Larger patterns work well at longer range, with smaller patterns being more effective at close range. This is known as the fractal effect. When the Waffen-SS came into being as a serious fighting force, their own researchers felt that the Wehrmacht's camo pattern was not good enough at close combat range, so they made their own by studying several visual effects, like that of sunlight passing through a forest. This brought forth many different designs, like the block pattern, the plane tree pattern, the oak leaf pattern, and the smoke pattern, which all followed the basic principles of camouflage, but focused on different shapes, stripes, and edges. In 1944, the P-dot pattern became the first all-season two-piece camo uniform. Its print displayed small groups of color splashes and dots instead of edges and forms. There was also the late-war Leiber pattern, which had a dark overprint made with infrared reflective ink. Both were revolutionary designs, yet they barely made it to the troops by the end of the war. Back to the tanks. During the early phases of the war, German panzers were all pretty much kept in a simple dark gray. This was intentional, as camouflage patterns worked well for a soldier or object that was stationary, but quickly lost value when it was on the move. However, from 1943 onward, German command tried to reduce casualties by applying a dark yellow base color to its tanks, and followed up with several ambush patterns depending on the theater of war. By 1944, this once more changed towards a more universal red oxide primer and colors appropriate to Central Europe. A panzer's main enemy at this point were dive bombers and tank buster aircraft that were outfitted with anti-tank cannons or rockets. Disruptive camouflage was actually a good shield against such air-to-ground attacks. A pilot that flew low over the battlefield at high speed, he's only got a couple of moments to spot and identify a target before he has to line up his attack run. Even the smallest margin of error could mean that the bombs or the rockets missed their target. Of course, the Axis's enemies did not neglect camouflaging themselves. The Soviet Union strictly adhered to the doctrine of maskirovka, which ordered every soldier to conceal himself in the field at all times to the best of his abilities. Each unit carried various nets and wire frames to use the local foliage as camouflage. Overall, the Red Army's basic khaki uniform gave satisfactory results, as its mix of green, brown, and gray proved well suited for the typical Russian countryside. But there were some more elaborate camo patterns as well. The white ZMK Arctic overgarments, for example, or the green-grayish Letny Camouflage summer pattern. This offered a camo pattern of dark leaves and brown or gray twigs on a khaki background. Both were mostly issued to specialists and elite forces like snipers or combat engineers. The same went for the more elaborated Maskirovka camouflage suit that had an amoeba pattern with large, irregular shapes printed on it. By 1944, the Soviets responded to German infrared devices and created a new costume with overlapping patterns of different kinds of green on yellow and tan. It had a lot of disruptive edges, looking like stairways. Red Army tanks, on the other hand, were usually painted in a universal dark green, with tones of yellow earth and dark browns. There were also a couple of winter patterns that mixed dark gray and black colors with a white background. Soviet doctrines argued that camouflaging efforts should focus on the artillery, though, as their static nature needed such protection much more than tanks, who would ruin expensive paint jobs quite quickly just by moving through the countryside. The British took advantage of their camouflage expertise from the Great War during the North African Campaign. The desert itself, as an always moving and shifting environment, was the home of trickery and mirages. On desert tanks, they ditched the green and issued a pale cream color to blend in with sand and stone, but that was short-lived, and soon they resorted to a simpler brownish coloration. There were also some experiments to add brown patches to the khaki uniforms of the infantry, but the traditional khaki battle dress was considered satisfactory overall. The big exception was the Denizen smock, basically a paratrooper jacket with a camo pattern of pea green blotches and reddish and dark brown colors. Specialized units like the Commandos, the SAS, or the Long Range Desert Group had the right to modify their outfits to their own needs, with one notable accessory being the SOE jumpsuit. Similar to the Denizen smock, the jumpsuit had blotches of brown, red, and green painted on a khaki background. Where the British excelled, however, was camouflage at sea. At the outbreak of the war, the British Admiralty was quick to return to the dazzle patterns of the Great War, the dazzle ships, a disruptive scheme that would break up the shape of the ship and disrupt the observer's judgment to correctly identify its size, speed, and type. The concept was expanded on, and eventually there were 3 major color schemes in place: light, intermediate or medium, and dark. Each was specially designed for the average light condition where that ship was to operate. The light scheme was applied for the North Atlantic and the northern route towards Arkhangelsk. It focused on pale shades and a high gloss, which created a greater reflection of light. There was little need for much contrast and additional shadows as the ship blended in with the lighter background of the far north. The medium scheme was applied for ships in the central or southern Atlantic. Here, the shades and colors were naturally much stronger due to the brighter sunlight. And the dark scheme was painted on ships in the eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, where they were exposed to excessively bright sunlight. Here, they needed highly contrasting shades to make camouflage work, with a lot of contrasting black and white paint strokes. When we imagine the jungle and island fighting of the Pacific Theater, we might expect a wide array of specialist camo suits to fit the environment. The opposite was actually the case. Although the Japanese had long since exchanged their white uniforms in favor of a khaki brown standard issue, there was little interest in investing in specialist camo patterns. This was partly due to Japanese martial culture, but also because a thick, overgrown jungle environment provided a lot of camo material itself. Japanese soldiers improvised their own ghillie suits by adding the local foliage and fiber to their jackets and helmets. Sure, this took time and work, but it made Japanese snipers harder to detect as they directly blended in with their immediate surroundings. On the American side, it was not before mid-1942 that Douglas MacArthur requested a new specialized jungle warfare uniform. The Army's Engineer Corps had already experimented with printed camo fabrics and patterns of green and brown, which eventually led to the one-piece jungle suit. But while the camo pattern was generally well received by the troops, the shortcomings of the uniform's design made most soldiers reject the one-piece version, and it had to be quickly withdrawn. A second generation of the jungle suit was eventually distributed in 1943, but by then, the consensus was that a single shade of olive, gray, or dark green achieved pretty much the same satisfactory results in the jungle. The U.S. Marine Corps made its own experiments and worked closely with the Army's experiments on the jungle suit. They had the additional problem that their fights would take them from the beige-brown sands of the beaches to the dark green jungle interior of an island in the same battle. So finding and designing a universal camo pattern was rather difficult. At the end, both services would discontinue the sophisticated camo designs, except for the helmet cover, which the Marines held onto even beyond this war. This was just a quick overview of the main camouflage patterns used by the warring nations in this war. There are, of course, many other instances of disruptive art being used to conceal guns, installations, civilian housings, and so on, of decoys and schemes, trickery and war paints being used to deceive or mislead the enemy. But for now, this is all you get to see. But if you want to see more specials like this one in future, then join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com, for it is the Army that finances our productions. And if you want to see a fantastic Spies and Ties episode with Astrid about Jasper Maskelyne, then you can click right here for that. It is very good. And do not forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.